Our next speaker is David Dow. He teaches at the University of Houston Law Center and at Rice University. And with a small team of lawyers and a large team of students for many years, he has been representing death row inmates. And I know you're going to be very interested in what you hear next from him. David Dow.
Good afternoon, everybody. Nearly all of my clients murdered somebody, and my job is to try to save their lives. When I talk about my work in the United States, particularly when I talk about it in Texas, typically 60% of the people in the room wonder why it is that lawyers who represent death row inmates care so much about saving the lives of convicted murderers. But 2 weeks ago, I was in London with my wife, Katya, and our son, Lincoln, talking to a room full of Europeans about the death penalty in America. And I suspect that out of the several hundred people in the room, there wasn't a single one who had that question. In Western Europe, as many of you may know, they don't use the death penalty anymore. Instead, the people in London wanted to ask me why I think it is that Americans think it's all right to carry out executions. But here today, at this moment anyway, I don't want to talk primarily about the question of whether it's ever appropriate to carry out executions. Instead, I want to talk about what we get by having a death penalty regime and what we give up in return. Now, to do that, I am going to need to spend just a brief moment on what might be considered a purely moral question, because we can't really talk about the costs and benefits without knowing what the benefits are. And the benefits of the death penalty system, if there are any, they're not economic, they're not deterrent. If there are any benefits, they stem from this moral intuition that some people have. And so to examine the perceived benefits of the system, I think we need to expose that moral intuition. To do that, I'd like to ask you all to do two brief thought experiments with me. They're very hard to do. They're painful. You're probably not going to want to do it. You might not be able to do it. But I'd like you to try. The first thing I'd like to ask you to do is close your eyes, and you have to close your eyes because it won't possibly work if they're open. And I'd like you to picture somebody who you love more than anyone else on earth. A spouse, a partner, a son, a daughter, a dear friend. I'd like you to picture that person whom you love in a house alone, in the kitchen cooking, or in the living room reading, or maybe in the bedroom watching TV. You're watching this person whom you love doing something that this person loves. And as you watch, you see two intruders enter the home. You see them, but the person who lives there doesn't. And one of these two intruders is holding a gun. I want you to focus on him in particular, and it will be a him. Is he black, white, brown, Asian, tall, short, heavy, thin? Does he have a beard, or is he clean shaved? What is he wearing? And I want you to watch as these two intruders work their way through the house of the person you love looking for things to steal. And now suddenly, the two intruders encounter your loved one. And your loved one is startled to see intruders in the house, and the intruders seem surprised as well. They might have expected the house to be empty. And so there's a moment of brief panic and confusion, and the intruder with the gun raises it and points it at your loved one and fires. fires, fires, killing your loved one. Now, if you're able to recreate emotion here, then I know that you feel grief and loss and pain and maybe anger. What I'd like to ask you to do is register your reaction to the murder and the murderer. Register that reaction and hold on to it because we'll come back to it. Okay, you can open your eyes. One down, one to go. Here's the second one. Please close your eyes again and picture the same house that you just pictured. And picture a person in that house. Man, woman, young, old. It doesn't make any difference except that you have to be picturing a stranger. You don't know the person. The person who you're picturing in the house is doing exactly the same thing that your loved one was doing a moment ago. Cooking, reading, watching TV, whatever. And again, as before, you watch as two intruders enter the house. You see them, but the person in the house doesn't. And you watch, as before, the two intruders work their way through the house looking for things to steal until they encounter the person who lives there. And again, there's a brief moment of panic and confusion when the person who lives there sees them and they see that person. And the intruder with the gun again raises it. And now look at the intruder with the gun because you know him. Not only do you know him, you've known him for a long time and you care about him. In fact, you might even love him. It might be somebody who you knew in high school. It might be somebody who you knew in college. It might be somebody who you know right now. And that person fires, 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 killing the stranger in the home. The government seeks the death penalty against this murderer. And the lawyers representing the defendant, they call you and they ask you at the trial to please explain to the jury why you think this murderer whom you know, shouldn't be executed. I want you to think about what you would say. Now, if you've done both of those experiments with me, if you've been able to recreate that emotion, then you know why we have the death penalty. We have the death penalty because some people, they react to a murder and say, the murderer ought to be executed. And we have people who oppose the death penalty because they look at a murder and they say, even the murderer ought not to be executed. We have a punishment regime that has preferred the first response to the second. And so let's talk about the costs and benefits of that preference. America is an extremely violent place. There are 15,000 to 20,000 homicides in the United States every year. That's 5.5 homicides for every 100,000 people, or 1 homicide every 30 minutes of every day. In the time that we are all here today at this wonderful UP experience, there are 20 people in the United States who will die as a result of homicide. Now, hardly anybody thinks that all of those cases should be death penalty cases. So how do we decide which ones will be? We narrow them down. The first thing that we do is we take some of those homicides and we call them murder. The second thing that we do is we take some of those murders and we say some of those will subject the person to the death penalty. In most states that have the death penalty, including Texas, the 2 murderers in our thought experiment would be eligible to face execution. Then we ask somebody else, usually a jury, to decide which of those people who are eligible for execution should in fact be executed. And finally, some number R. In the United States last year, there were 43 executions, of which 13 were in Texas. So far this year, there have been 33 executions, of which 11 have been in Texas, including one last night. So, on the one hand, we have 15 or 20,000 homicides, and on the other hand, we have 35 or 40 executions. How do we decide which 0.2% of all homicides will result in a death sentence? The answer is a legal process. A death penalty case is a story that has 4 chapters. The first chapter of every case is always the same because it always begins with tragedy. The inexcusable murder of an innocent human being. The murderer is arrested, convicted, sentenced to death, and has that conviction and sentence upheld on appeal. Chapter 2 consists of a complicated legal proceeding known as a state habeas corpus appeal. Chapter 3 is an even more complicated legal proceeding known as a federal habeas corpus appeal. And Chapter 4 is everything else. Maybe the lawyers figure out a way to go back to Chapter 2 or Chapter 3. Maybe they write a clemency petition begging the governor to spare the life of their client. Maybe they conclude that there's just nothing left to do and they do nothing at all. And at the end, there's an execution. Now, contrary to what many people believe, the reason that death penalty cases cost a lot isn't because of Chapter 2, it isn't because of Chapter 3, it isn't because of Chapter 4, it's not even because of the aggregate of Chapters 2, 3, and 4. Death penalty cases cost a lot because of Chapter 1. The objective of the lawyer in Chapter 1 is to persuade the jury of the defendant facing death to spare the life of someone who has committed murder. Now, if you think back to that second thought experiment that we did, where I asked you to tell a jury why someone shouldn't be executed, you were probably able to do that. You were probably able to do that even if you yourself are a strong death penalty proponent. And the reason that you were able to do that, if you were able to do that, is because you know the murderer in that second experiment. And you therefore know things about that person that are quite different from the reason that that person is on trial. That is the responsibility of the trial lawyers, to get into the position to be able to tell the jury what the jury has to hear in order to spare the life of the defendant. The trial lawyers need to learn everything about their client. In my office, when we represent someone, we construct a family tree that goes back at least 3 generations, looking for characteristics that run in families, things like alcoholism, mental illness, mental retardation. We interview every member of our client's family, parents, grandparents, spouses, children, siblings, step-siblings, half-siblings, aunts, uncles, cousins, every teacher, every friend, virtually every acquaintance whom our client has ever known. We acquire all kinds of records, medical records, hospital records, school records, prison records if there are previous incarcerations. We hire experts, people like psychiatrists and psychologists, to examine our client and offer us an opinion as to how somebody who came into the world the same way that you and I did became someone who committed murder. The point of all of this knowledge is to be able to tell the jury why they should spare someone's life. I tell my wife that I frequently know my clients better than I know her. Sometimes I know them better than I know myself. We haven't even picked the jury yet. Now we've got to pick the jury. In a typical criminal case, it takes a couple of hours to pick a jury. In a death penalty case, for reasons I won't go into today, it takes weeks and usually months. We spend more than a year investigating the case. We spend a couple of months picking a jury. We've been paying lawyers and investigators and experts, and we haven't even started the trial. And then finally we start the trial. But a death penalty trial is really 2 trials, not 1, even though they're called phases. At the first trial, which we call the guilt phase, we ask the jury a factual question. We say, did this guy do it? And then if the jury says yes, we have a second trial, which we call a punishment phase, where we ask them a much harder question because it's a moral question. And we say, what ought we to do with this person? In other states, experts have examined the cost of Chapter 1 of a death penalty story. In Texas, nobody had. So the team of lawyers that I work with, and I work with 3 lawyers, we got a student and we started adding it up. We looked at vouchers, we looked at budgets, we called court personnel, we called judges, we called district attorneys, we called attorney generals. We determined that Chapter 1 costs between $500,000 and $1.2 million. That's 3 to 4 times what a non-death penalty trial costs. If you throw in chapters 2, 3, and 4, you add another $500,000. So when you get to the end of those 4 chapters, you have a human being who's facing death, and that person has the world's greatest incentive to escape. And as a result of that, the costs of security inside prison are uniquely high in death penalty cases. By the time you throw in the additional cost of security in prison, court costs, and various other miscellaneous costs, you tack on another $1 million. If you've been doing the math with me in your head as I've been going, then this next slide is not going to surprise you. But that's what it costs to do a death penalty case in Texas. That's a typical case, $2 to $3 million. And there are cases that cost a whole lot more. Now, I said a moment ago that there have been 11 executions so far this year in Texas. I think of that as $30 million that could have been spent another way. From 2000 until 2012, there have been 278 executions in Texas. The slide says 277 because it doesn't count last night's. That represents more than $500 million carrying out punishment in less than 1% of all of the homicide cases. Now, there are some people who support the death penalty who would say, I don't care what it costs. I believe in the death penalty so deeply that it is worth the price. And if that's your view, I'm not going to argue against it today. But I think that we do need to know what that price is and what we give up by spending it. There was an execution in Texas last night. If we had sent that prisoner to spend the rest of his life in prison, rather than sending him through the death penalty regime, we would have saved enough money to operate an elementary school in HISD for a year. If we had sent that prisoner, that murderer, to spend the rest of his life in prison, rather than through the 4 chapters of the death penalty story, we would have saved enough money to train, hire, and pay 40 new police officers. If we took all of the prisoners that Texas has executed so far in 2012 and had sent them to spend the rest of their lives in prison rather than to the execution chamber, we would have saved enough money to open the world's largest food bank and feed 80,000 people a week. Those are the choices that we make. When I was asking you all to do those 2 thought experiments with me, I was showing you this slide. This is a painting that was painted by the father of a client of mine who was executed just over 2 years ago. The father of my client watched his son be executed. In a second witness room next door, separated from my client's father by a cinder block wall, were 2 young men, sons of the man my client had killed. They watched as the murderer of their father was put to death. I don't have any doubt but that those 2 men were entitled to justice. I don't have any doubt but that our society is warranted in punishing murderers and punishing them severely. But there are various modes of punishment, and there are various paths to justice. And the path that we have so far chosen is an expensive one. It is a path that consumes vast resources to attack just a tiny fraction of the problem. Resources that might well be better spent attacking the problem of crime in a different way. Thank you.
David, I have a question for you. So one of the arguments that people use for death penalty is deterrence. And I teach a class on neuroscience and the law, as you know, and each year I ask my class, I pull out $20 and I say, can anyone tell me who the last person was that was executed in Houston? And even when it happened, no one ever wins the $20.
Yes.
So my question to you is about deterrence and whether it has any effect when nobody actually knows what's happening behind closed doors, and what you think about the deterrence issue in general.
I think that it's clear that there's no deterrent effect, and I frequently use two examples to illustrate why that's true. My wife and I, our son is 12 years old. When he gets a driver's license, he's going to have to keep the phone in the trunk, because we can teach him that when you text, you might kill yourself. But he doesn't actually believe that that's going to happen to him. Every client who I've ever had has known people who have been killed, but it didn't have an impact on them. That's one story. Here's the second. I was talking about this at lunch today. When I go to the prison now to visit my clients, I have to go through a security apparatus that's like I'm getting on an international flight. It didn't used to be that way. I have to take off my shoes, and the guards look at the bottom of my socks, so I try to wear socks that don't have holes in them. I've got to walk through a metal detector. They scan all of my things. What they're looking for are cell phones. Because, as some of you may know, a number of years ago, there was a cell phone scandal on death row. There were more than 100 cell phones that were being circulated around death row. How did they get there? They got there because the guards sold them. Here's the point of the story. One of those death row inmates, who wasn't supposed to have a phone at all, he used his phone to call a state senator who was known for being tough on crime at the state senator's home during the dinner hour to complain about his treatment on death row. That tells you the capacity of the typical person on death row to think about consequences. For this person on death row, he couldn't even think about the consequences of using a contraband cell phone. So you're dealing largely with a population of people that are not accustomed to doing the sort of cost-benefit analysis that is a premise of any deterrence model.
Years ago, I heard you mention that maybe capital punishment would work as a deterrent for white-collar criminals.
Yes.
Yes. Because they would understand it a little
That's
bit
right.
better.
People whose lives revolve around budget sheets, if you just execute one insider trader, you'll solve the problem.
I have one last question for you. What was it like for you the first time you visited death row? Was it what you expected?
Well, the first time that I visited death row was located in a different prison from the one that it's in now. It was located at something called the Ellis Unit in Huntsville. And there was not only no air conditioning in the cells, but there also wasn't any air conditioning in the room where the lawyers visited with their clients. And I was there in August. So the enduring memory that I have of death row is that it was a prison that reminded me of Cool Hand Luke. You know, it was from a different era. Death row now is very different now. It's highly sterile. You have to walk through 1 million electronic doors to see your clients. And so now the enduring image that I have is truly of a fortress.
But what about the clients themselves? Were they the murderers that you expected?
Yes. Thank you for that question. When I started doing death penalty work, I didn't really even have an opinion about the death penalty. I sort of expected that everybody on death row was probably like Hannibal Lecter, you know, from Silence of the Lambs, or maybe Charles Manson in California. But of course, Charles Manson isn't even on death row in California. He'll never get out, but he comes up for parole. And Hannibal Lecter is a fictional character. And what I discovered, in fact, is that the people on death row were nothing like what I expected. I mean, they look like you or me. They're quite often people of color, but beyond that, they don't look like people who you would cross the street to avoid. And so I think that what truly struck me was the apparent normalcy of so many of these guys.
Thank you so much for the work you do, David.
Thank you.